The silence stretched across the valley like a death shroud, broken only by the distant crackle of radio static and the metallic taste of fear that hung in the air. Somewhere in the jagged mountains of Afghanistan's Kunar province, 12 of America's most elite warriors had vanished without a trace. Not captured, not killed in a firefight, simply gone as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reeves pressed his fingers against his temples, staring at the tactical display that showed nothing but empty grid squares and unanswered radio calls. SEAL Team 7 had been radio silent for 18 hours. Their last known position, a ghost town called Shahidar, nestled in a canyon that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate. 3 rescue attempts had already failed. 2 Black Hawks forced to abort due to intense ground fire. 1 Marine recon team pinned down and extracted under cover of darkness, their leader's final transmission a whispered warning. Something's wrong here. This isn't just Taliban. The operations center at Forward Operating Base Chapman buzzed with tension so thick it could be cut with a K-bar. Maps covered every surface, red pins marking failed insertion points, blue circles showing enemy positions that seemed to shift like smoke. Drone feeds flickered across multiple screens, revealing nothing but empty valleys and abandoned compounds. It was as if the enemy knew exactly where to look, exactly when to strike. "Sir, we've got someone requesting permission to volunteer for solo reconnaissance." Staff Sergeant Phillips approached with a clipboard, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes betraying something close to skepticism. CW03 Vesper Kine, Apache pilot, 160th SOAR. Reeves looked up from the maps, his weathered face creasing into a frown. He knew that name. The quiet one. The pilot who flew night missions with surgical precision but rarely spoke in briefings. The woman who'd earned her wings in Iraq when everyone said she was too small for the cockpit, too soft for combat. Now she wanted to fly alone into a valley that had already claimed 3 aircraft and a dozen good men. "Denied," Reeves said without hesitation. "We're not sending a single bird into that meat grinder, especially not." "Sir?" The voice came from the doorway, calm and steady as mountain stone. Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine stood at attention, her flight suit bearing the subdued patches of the Night Stalkers, her dark eyes holding something that made seasoned operators take notice. "With respect, Colonel, those men are running out of time." The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound as Vesper walked toward her Apache helicopter. Call sign, Raven 77. The AH-64E Guardian sat like a predatory insect on the tarmac, its tandem cockpits gleaming in the Afghan light, M230 chain gun slung beneath its nose like a mechanical fang. Maintenance crews finished their final checks, their movements efficient despite the tension that gripped the entire base. Vesper's crew chief, Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, approached with the pre-flight checklist. "Ma'am, you sure about this? Going in solo against whatever took out an entire SEAL team." Santos had worked with Vesper for 3 years, had seen her thread the needle on missions that would have broken lesser pilots, but this felt different. "The SEALs aren't gone, Santos. They're trapped." Vesper's voice carried the certainty of someone who had studied every available piece of intelligence, every fragment of radio transmission, every pixel of drone footage. "Someone's been feeding information to the enemy, telling them exactly when and where our birds will be, but they won't expect a single Apache flying nap of the earth at first light." She climbed into the front seat of the tandem cockpit, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 engines spooled up with a distinctive whine, rotor blades beginning their lazy rotation that would soon become an invisible blur of death. Through her helmet's integrated display, weapon systems came online, 30 70mm Hydra rockets, 1,200 rounds of 30mm ammunition, and 4 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Enough firepower to level a city block. "Raven 77, this is Chapman Tower," the radio crackled. You are cleared for immediate departure, bearing 270 degrees. Be advised, weather is deteriorating rapidly. Mountain winds gusting to 40 knots. Chapman Tower, Raven 77 copies all. Vesper's response was calm, professional. Departing your station, time now 0645 local. The Apache lifted smoothly from the tarmac, nose tilting forward as it accelerated toward the mountains. Below, soldiers stopped their morning routines to watch the lone helicopter disappear into the maze of valleys and ridges, where 12 good men waited for a miracle they might never see. As the distance closed to the target area, Vesper's training took over completely. The Apache skimmed the ground at barely 50 feet, following the natural contours of the terrain, using every depression and ridge line to mask her approach. Through her helmet's target acquisition and designation system, she could see the heat signatures of small animals, the cold metal of abandoned vehicles, the geometric patterns that indicated human habitation. The valley entrance loomed ahead, a narrow cut in the mountain face that satellite imagery had never fully mapped. Intelligence reports suggested it opened into a wider basin where Shahidar sat like a cancer in the landscape, but no Western forces had eyes on the ground to confirm. As Vesper banked the Apache into the entrance, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before contact. Any station, this is Raven 77 conducting armed reconnaissance in Sector Bravo 7, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. If anyone's listening, help is coming. The radio remained silent, but somewhere in the static, Vesper thought she heard something else. The faintest whisper of a voice, American, desperate, saying words she couldn't quite make out. Her jaw tightened as the Apache dove deeper into the valley, into the heart of whatever had swallowed 12 of the military's finest. The canyon walls closed in around Raven 77 as Vesper pushed deeper into enemy territory, her Apache's rotor wash echoing off the rock faces in a rhythmic thunder that announced her presence to anyone within miles. Through the TADS display, she caught her first glimpse of Shahidar, not the abandoned village intelligence had described, but a living, breathing operations center. Concrete bunkers had been carved into the hillsides, camouflaged so well that only infrared imaging revealed their true nature. Supply trucks moved along mountain paths that didn't exist on any map, and armed fighters, far more sophisticated than typical Taliban, moved with military precision between defensive positions. This wasn't a terrorist hideout. It was a fortress. Jesus, Vesper whispered into her microphone, knowing no one would hear. The enemy had spent months, maybe years, preparing this position. No wonder 3 rescue attempts had failed. They hadn't been fighting insurgents, they'd been fighting a military organization with resources, training, and most importantly, inside information about American operations. Movement caught her attention through the targeting system. There, in a compound near the village center, figures in desert camouflage moved between buildings under armed guard. The SEAL team, or what remained of it, was being held in a series of connected structures that formed a natural prison yard. As Vesper adjusted the Apache's sensors for maximum resolution, she could make out details that made her blood run cold. The prisoners were being systematically interrogated. Men were brought out individually, questioned, then either returned to the holding area or led to a separate building from which they never emerged. Time was running out faster than anyone at Chapman realized. Any American forces in Shahidar, this is Army aviation coming to get you out. If you can hear this transmission, respond on any frequency. Vesper kept her voice steady, professional, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for a response. Static, then so faint she almost missed it. Raven, 7-7, this is Poseidon, actual. Commander Jake Morrison, SEAL Team 7's leader, was alive. Vesper's hands tightened on the Apache's controls as she processed the implications. If Morrison was transmitting, it meant the enemy hadn't found their emergency radio, which meant there was still hope for extraction. Poseidon Actual, Raven 77. What's your status? She kept her transmission brief, knowing enemy forces were likely monitoring all frequencies. 12 souls, 8 still breathing, heavy resistance. They're moving us in 30 minutes. Morrison's voice faded in and out, each word a battle against whatever injuries he'd sustained. Vesper, is that you? The use of her first name sent a chill down her spine. She'd flown Morrison's team on insertion missions before, had earned their respect through precision flying under impossible conditions. But this was different, personal, a plea from one warrior to another. The morning mist that had provided concealment was beginning to burn off under the Afghan sun, and Vesper knew she had minutes before her Apache would be visible to every fighter in the valley. The smart tactical decision would be to mark the position, return to base, and coordinate a proper rescue operation. But 8 Navy SEALs didn't have hours for proper coordination. Vesper's fingers danced across the weapons control panel as she began to calculate firing solutions. 30 Hydra rockets against fortified positions, 4 Hellfire missiles for the hardened bunkers, 1,200 rounds of 30 ammunition for anything that moved after the initial barrage. It should have been enough firepower for any rescue operation, but as she studied the enemy positions through her targeting system, she realized the horrible truth. There were too many of them. 50, maybe 60 fighters with military-grade weapons and prepared positions. Surface-to-air missiles that could knock her Apache from the sky before she completed her attack run. Anti-aircraft guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the narrow valley into a death trap. Poseidon Actual, what's the enemy strength? She asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than her estimates. Battalion-sized element, foreign advisors. Someone's been feeding them our playbook. Morrison's transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of shouting voices and automatic weapons fire. Vesper banked the Apache hard left, using a rocky outcrop to break line of sight with the village as tracer rounds began arcing up toward her position. The enemy had spotted her, and the entire valley was about to become a killing field. As she pulled back from the immediate threat, Vesper's mind raced through tactical options. A direct assault was suicide. A retreat meant abandoning 8 American warriors to torture and death. But there was a third option, one that would require every ounce of skill she developed over 15 years of combat flying. She was going to have to become something no one expected, not a rescue operation, but a force of nature that would turn the enemy's prepared positions against them. The Apache's engine screamed as she climbed toward the canyon rim, preparing for an assault that would either save 8 good men or add her name to the casualty reports. Through the static of battlefield communications, she heard Morrison one more time. Raven 77, whatever you're planning, we trust you. Trust. The word hit Vesper like a physical blow as she positioned her Apache for what could be her final attack run. These men, America's finest warriors, were placing their lives in the hands of a pilot most people at Chapman barely noticed. The quiet woman who flew night missions without complaint, who never pushed for recognition, who had spent her career proving that competence mattered more than politics. The enemy positions spread out below her like a tactical puzzle waiting to be solved. Bunkers carved into hillsides, weapons emplacements that covered every approach route, anti-aircraft systems positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Whoever had planned this operation understood American tactics better than most American officers. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd planned for conventional rescue operations, multiple aircraft, coordinated ground support, predictable approach routes. They hadn't planned for a single Apache flown by someone desperate enough to try the impossible. Vesper rolled the Apache inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using gravity to build airspeed while keeping the aircraft's heat signature masked by the sun. At 500 feet above the canyon floor, she rolled level and began her attack run, the Apache's nose lowering like a hunting hawk spotting prey. Poseidon Actual, heads down in 30 seconds, she transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from absolute commitment to a course of action. The first Hellfire missile streaked from its rail at maximum range, guided by laser designation toward a bunker that protected the valley's main entrance. The explosion sent chunks of concrete and human remains cascading down the hillside, momentarily stunning the enemy forces who had grown comfortable in their prepared positions. Vesper didn't wait to assess damage. The Apache raced across the valley floor at nearly 200 miles per hour, its 30 chain gun erupting in precisely controlled bursts that shredded anything resembling a defensive position. Hydra rockets rippled from their pods in pairs, each one guided toward targets identified through her helmet's targeting system. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder of high explosives and automatic cannon fire that echoed off the canyon walls and shook the earth beneath the village. But Vesper wasn't trying to destroy everything. She was conducting a symphony of destruction, designed to create a corridor of chaos through which 8 Navy SEALs could make their escape. Enemy fighters who had been confidently manning defensive positions moments earlier now scrambled for cover as death rained from above. The Apache's attack had lasted less than 60 seconds, but it had transformed a carefully prepared ambush into a scene from hell. Poseidon Actual, move now. Vesper's voice cut through the explosions and gunfire. Rally Point Alpha, 200 meters north of your position. Through her targeting system, she could see figures in desert camouflage moving between buildings, 8 shapes that moved with the distinctive tactical precision of Navy SEALs even under extreme duress. They were wounded, exhausted, but they were fighting their way toward freedom with the desperate energy of men who knew this was their only chance. But the enemy wasn't finished. As Vesper pulled the Apache into a climbing turn to begin another attack run, she spotted the distinctive signature of a surface-to-air missile system powering up on a ridge line to her east. Russian-made, military-grade, and operated by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The radar-locked tone screamed in her headset as the missile system acquired her Apache as a target. In seconds, a heat-seeking projectile would be climbing toward her aircraft at 3 times the speed of sound, and there would be nowhere to run in the confines of the narrow valley. Vesper's training took over completely as she processed the threat. The Apache bucked and weaved through defensive maneuvers that subjected her body to gravitational forces that would have incapacitated most pilots, but her focus remained absolute. Through the targeting system, she could still see the 8 SEALs fighting their way toward the rally point, still dependent on her ability to keep enemy attention focused skyward. The missile launched with a plume of smoke and flame, its seeker head immediately locking onto the Apache's engine heat signature. Vesper had perhaps 5 seconds to live, and 8 American warriors depended on her using those seconds wisely. She rolled the Apache inverted again and dove directly toward the missile system, her aircraft's nose pointed like an arrow at the crew that was trying to kill her. The range closed with terrifying speed, Apache and missile racing toward each other at a combined velocity of over 500 miles per hour. At the last possible second, Vesper released her final Hellfire missile and pulled the Apache into a climb so violent that the gravitational forces compressed her vision into a gray tunnel. The missile passed beneath her aircraft by less than 50 feet, its proximity fuse detonating harmlessly in empty air while her Hellfire found its mark on the ridge line. The explosion eliminated the SAM site and sent a message to every enemy fighter in the valley. The Apache pilot wasn't just conducting a rescue operation. She was hunting them with a precision and aggression they'd never experienced. But ammunition was running low, fuel was becoming critical, and somewhere in the chaos below, 8 Navy SEALs were still fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Poseidon Actual, what's your status? Vesper called as she positioned the Apache for what might be her final attack run. We're at the rally point, Morrison's voice was stronger now, energized by the hope of extraction. "But we've got company coming from the south. Battalion-sized element moving to cut us off." Through her targeting system, Vesper could see them. Hundreds of armed fighters moving with military precision to surround the rally point before any rescue could be effected. They'd been held in reserve, waiting for exactly this scenario, and now they were deploying with devastating efficiency. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. 8 exhausted SEALs with limited ammunition facing a reinforced company of enemy fighters in prepared positions. One Apache helicopter running low on fuel and weapons against an enemy force that had been planning this engagement for months. By every tactical calculation, this was the moment to call for backup, to mark the position and coordinate a proper rescue operation. But Vesper looked at her fuel gauge and knew the truth. There wasn't time for backup. There was only now, only this moment, only the choice between abandoning 8 good men or finding a way to beat impossible odds. She keyed her microphone one final time, her voice carrying across the static-filled radio waves to reach not just the trapped SEALs, but every frequency monitor at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Any station monitoring this frequency, Raven 77 is conducting emergency extraction of Poseidon team. Mark my position and vector all available assets to Shahidar Village, grid coordinates. She rattled off the numbers with mechanical precision, knowing that help was at least 30 minutes away. 30 minutes these 8 men didn't have. The Apache dove toward the rally point as enemy fighters closed in from 3 directions, their automatic weapons chattering like deadly insects in the mountain air. Vesper's last magazine of 30 ammunition stitched across their positions, buying precious seconds for the SEALs to establish a defensive perimeter, but it wasn't enough. Raven 77 were taking heavy fire from the east. Morrison's voice carried the strain of combat and desperation. "They're going to overrun us." Vesper's ammunition counter showed zeros across the board. No rockets, no missiles, no cannon rounds, just a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a pilot who had never learned how to quit. But as she pulled the Apache into another climbing turn, something caught her attention through the targeting system. The enemy's ammunition depot, carved into the hillside and camouflaged but clearly visible through infrared imaging. Tons of explosive material, carefully stockpiled to support extended operations. The range was perfect, the angle was clean, and the Apache's turbine engines, running at maximum power, generated exhaust flames hot enough to ignite almost anything. It was completely insane. Against every rule of engagement, every safety protocol, every rational tactical decision. But as Vesper looked down at 8 American warriors making their last stand in an Afghan valley, rationality seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. She rolled the Apache inverted one final time and pointed its nose directly at the ammunition depot, engine exhaust streaming behind her like twin torches in the morning sun. The airspeed indicator climbed toward the aircraft's structural limits as gravity and desperation combined to turn the Apache into a guided missile with a pilot who had finally run out of conventional options. "Poseidon actual," she transmitted, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with an impossible decision. "In 10 seconds, the world is going to change. Be ready to move." Through the chaos of battle, Commander Morrison's voice came back one final time, carrying a respect earned through shared danger and mutual trust. "Copy that, Raven. We'll be ready." The ammunition depot grew larger in Vesper's vision as the Apache dove toward what should have been mutual destruction. But she wasn't planning to die today. She was planning to create a miracle, even if it killed her. The explosion, when it came, was visible from 50 miles away. A pillar of flame and smoke that rose above the mountains like a nuclear sunrise, sending shock waves that shattered windows in villages throughout the valley and registered on seismographs in 3 countries. The ammunition depot didn't just explode, It vaporized, taking with it hundreds of enemy fighters, their equipment, their confidence, and their ability to continue the battle. But Vesper wasn't there to see it. At the last possible second, she had pulled the Apache out of its suicide dive and used the shock wave from the explosion to boost her aircraft clear of the blast radius. The maneuver subjected her body to gravitational forces that should have rendered her unconscious, but desperation and training combined to keep her functional through the impossible. The Apache tumbled through the air like a broken toy, its systems failing one by one as structural damage from the blast wave overwhelmed redundant safety systems. Engine fire warnings screamed in Vesper's headset as she fought to regain control of an aircraft that was disintegrating around her. But she was still flying, barely, damaged beyond any reasonable expectation of survival, but still flying over a battlefield that had been transformed from a carefully planned ambush into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. Poseidon Actual Raven 77, she called, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining consciousness. Report your status. Raven 77, you magnificent crazy woman, Morrison's voice carried joy and disbelief in equal measure. The entire enemy force is gone, completely gone. We're secure at Rally Point Alpha and ready for immediate extraction. Through the Apache's failing systems, Vesper could see them, 8 figures in desert camouflage, moving with renewed energy across terrain that minutes earlier had been swarming with enemy fighters. They were wounded, exhausted, but alive and free, because a single helicopter pilot had been willing to attempt the impossible. But the Apache was dying beneath her. Engine temperatures climbing toward critical levels, hydraulic systems failing, flight controls becoming increasingly unresponsive. She had perhaps minutes before the aircraft would be unable to maintain controlled flight, and the narrow valley offered no suitable landing zones. Chapman Control, Raven 77, she called on the command frequency. Emergency extraction required at Rally Point Alpha, 8 Poseidon Souls plus 1 Apache pilot. Aircraft is critically damaged and will not make it home. Raven 77, Chapman Control, came the immediate response. Extraction assets inbound, estimated time of arrival 20 minutes. Can you maintain position? Vesper looked at her instrument panel, nodding the red warning lights that covered every system display like Christmas decorations in hell. 20 minutes was an eternity for an aircraft that was already flying on borrowed time and pure willpower. Chapman Control, I'll hold position as long as possible, she transmitted, knowing that her personal survival was now secondary to ensuring the SEALs made it home safely. The Apache limped through the air above Rally Point Alpha like a wounded bird, its rotor blades making sounds that no helicopter should make, its engines producing power through mechanical determination rather than proper engineering. But it stayed airborne, providing overwatch for 8 American warriors who had learned to trust in miracles. Far to the east, the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters began to echo off the canyon walls. Heavy rotors, multiple aircraft, the cavalry finally arriving to finish what one determined pilot had started. But as the rescue formation approached, everyone involved understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of military aviation. One pilot, one Apache, impossible odds and a willingness to risk everything for 8 men she barely knew but considered family. The rescue helicopters swept into the valley like angels of mercy, their crews already aware they were responding to something extraordinary. Radio chatter had carried the story across every military frequency in Afghanistan. The Apache pilot who had single-handedly destroyed an enemy stronghold and saved a SEAL team through a combination of skill, courage, and tactical decisions that defied conventional wisdom. As the first Black Hawk settled into a landing at Rally Point Alpha, Commander Morrison and his surviving team members moved with efficiency born of urgency and relief. 8 warriors who had faced death with professional composure, but who now carried themselves with the particular gratitude of men who understood they'd been witness to something remarkable. Above them, Vesper fought to keep the dying Apache airborne, her instrument panel a constellation of warning lights and system failures. The aircraft shuddered with each rotor revolution, metal fatigue finally claiming systems that had been pushed far beyond their design limits. Raven 77, Poseidon Actual, Morrison's voice came through the radio with formal precision. All 8 souls aboard extraction aircraft. You are cleared to land immediately. But as Vesper looked down at the rally point, she could see the problem. The narrow mountain valley offered no suitable landing zone for an Apache, especially one with failing flight controls and compromised structural integrity. The extraction aircraft had barely enough space to operate, and adding a damaged helicopter to the mix would endanger everyone. Poseidon Actual, Rally Point Alpha is too hot for additional aircraft, she responded, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the smoke now filling the Apache's cockpit. Extraction birds should depart immediately. I'll find an alternative landing site. There was a moment of silence on the radio, and Vesper knew that everyone monitoring the frequency understood the implications of her transmission. The Apache was dying, the pilot was trapped in a valley with no suitable landing zones, and the extraction aircraft needed to depart before enemy reinforcements could respond to the massive explosion. Raven 77, Morrison's voice carried emotions that military training couldn't entirely suppress. Is there anything we can do? Vesper looked at her instruments one final time, calculating fuel remaining, engine performance, and the distance to any conceivable landing zone. The mathematics were unforgiving. The Apache had minutes of flight time remaining, and safety was at least an hour away. Negative, Poseidon Actual, she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Get our people home safely. That's the mission. The extraction aircraft began their departure, lifting off from Rally Point Alpha with precious cargo, 8 American warriors who would live to fight another day, because one pilot had been willing to risk everything. As they climbed toward safety, their crews could see the lone Apache continuing to circle the valley, smoke trailing from its engines like a funeral pyre in the morning sun. But Vesper wasn't finished yet. As the rescue helicopters disappeared over the canyon rim, she found herself alone with a dying aircraft and a landscape that offered no mercy to pilots who made mistakes or pushed their luck too far. The fuel gauge showed less than 5 minutes of flight time, and the engine fire warnings had become a constant scream in her headset. That's when she saw it, a section of riverbed, dried by the Afghan summer, running along the valley floor just wide enough to accommodate an Apache if the approach angle was perfect, and the pilot was willing to accept that survival was unlikely. It wasn't a landing zone by any definition that would appear in a flight manual, but it was the only option that didn't involve flying into a mountainside. The Apache's controls felt like wrestling with a dying animal as Vesper lined up for what pilots euphemistically called a controlled crash. No power for a proper approach, no margin for error, just gravity and whatever skill remained in hands that had been flying helicopters for 15 years. At 50 feet above the riverbed, both engines finally quit. The Apache fell like a stone, its rotor blades windmilling in auto-rotation, all pretense of controlled flight abandoned in favor of basic survival. Vesper's final act as a pilot was to level the aircraft's attitude and pray that the landing skids would absorb enough impact energy to keep the fuel tanks from exploding. The crash was spectacular and surprisingly survivable. The Apache hit the riverbed at nearly 60 miles per hour, bounced once, and slid for over 200 yards before coming to rest against a boulder the size of a small building. Metal screamed against stone, rotor blades disintegrated, and various components separated from the airframe in ways that would have horrified the engineers who designed them. But when the dust settled, Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine was still breathing. Emergency locator beacons activated automatically, sending distress signals that would guide rescue forces to her position. She was injured, certainly, and stranded in hostile territory with nothing but a sidearm and survival equipment. But she was alive, and somewhere in the mountains above, 8 Navy SEALs owed their lives to her willingness to attempt the impossible. As Vesper struggled to free herself from the wreckage of her Apache, she could hear the distant sound of approaching helicopters. Not enemy aircraft, but American, vectoring toward her beacon signal with the determination of warriors who never left their own behind. The rescue, when it came, was swift and professional. Combat search and rescue crews who had heard the radio chatter and understood they were extracting someone special. The pilot who had single-handedly changed the course of a battle and saved 8 American lives through tactical decisions that would be studied in military academies for generations. But as they lifted Vesper from the wreckage and loaded her aboard the rescue helicopter, she was already thinking beyond the immediate mission. There would be debriefings, investigations, questions about decisions that had pushed every regulatory boundary and defied conventional military wisdom. The politics could wait. 8 good men were going home to their families, and sometimes that was enough. As the rescue helicopter climbed toward safety, carrying a pilot who had just redefined what was possible in military aviation, radio chatter across Afghanistan told and retold the story of Raven 77. The Apache pilot who had destroyed an enemy stronghold with nothing but determination and a willingness to risk everything for soldiers she barely knew. The story would grow in the telling, as stories do. But those who had been there, who had monitored the radio frequencies and witnessed the impossible, knew that some legends were built on simple truth. Sometimes one person with the right skills and the courage to use them could change everything. In the years that followed, military historians would analyze Vesper's tactical decisions, flight instructors would teach her maneuvers, and psychologists would study the mental processes that allowed a single pilot to overcome impossible odds. But for the 8 Navy SEALs who walked away from Shahidar that day, the analysis was much simpler. They had been saved by someone who understood that competence mattered more than recognition, that courage was measured in actions rather than words, and that sometimes the quiet ones were the most dangerous enemies of all. The Apache program would eventually replace Raven 77, commissioning a new aircraft with upgraded systems and improved capabilities. But they would never replace the pilot who had turned a routine call sign into a legend that would inspire military aviators for generations. Because on a morning in Afghanistan when everything went wrong and conventional wisdom failed, Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine had proven that sometimes one person, properly motivated and absolutely committed, could beat any odds. Even the SEALs, America's finest warriors, had learned something that day about the limits of the possible. And they had learned it from a pilot whose quiet competence had hidden a warrior's heart and a tactical mind that could find victory where others saw only defeat. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed many battles, but few that would be remembered like the morning when an Apache helicopter crossed the valley at mast height and changed everything. When a single pilot named Vesper proved that legends weren't born from recognition ceremonies or medal citations, but from moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things because someone's life depended on it. The radio call signs would fade into history, the aircraft would be replaced, the participants would move on to other assignments. But in the collective memory of those who served, the story would remain unchanged. The day when even the SEALs lost their edge, until her Apache crossed the valley at mast height and reminded everyone what impossible really meant. The sound of rotor blades would always carry that memory, the distinctive rhythm of an Apache helicopter, flown by someone who understood that the most important battles weren't always the ones that made headlines, but the ones where a few good people refused to let their teammates down. In a profession built on tradition and precedent, Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine had established new standards for what aviation courage looked like. Not recklessness, but calculated risk in service of others. Not showmanship, but precision applied with devastating effect when lives hung in the balance. The valley called Shahidar would eventually return to the silence of the mountains, its strategic importance diminished by the elimination of the enemy force that had made it significant. But for 8 Navy SEALs and 1 Army pilot, it would always be the place where they learned that miracles were possible when the right person was in the right place with the determination to make them happen. As military historians would later note, the engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to successful extraction. But in those 2 hours, every assumption about single aircraft operations, pilot limitations, and tactical possibilities had been challenged and rewritten by someone who had never sought recognition, but had earned it through actions that transcended conventional military achievement. The morning sun that had witnessed the impossible continued its arc across the Afghan sky, illuminating a landscape forever changed by the passage of one Apache helicopter, and the pilot who had dared to attempt what everyone else considered suicide. But Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine had never been everyone else. She had been the quiet professional who flew night missions without complaint, who studied her craft with obsessive precision, and who understood that someday, when the situation was desperate enough, all that preparation might be the difference between 8 funerals and 8 homecomings. The sound of her Apache's rotor blades had faded into memory, but their echo would continue to resonate through the careers of every pilot who heard the story and understood its significance. In a profession where precision mattered and lives depended on split-second decisions, Vesper had demonstrated what mastery looked like when combined with absolute commitment to the mission. The valley had tested her, the enemy had underestimated her, and the impossible had become inevitable through the application of skill, courage, and determination that would be remembered long after the wars ended and the participants returned home. For in the end, that's what legends are built from, not the recognition that follows, but the moments when someone chooses to risk everything because the alternative is unacceptable. The quiet moments when competence becomes heroism and preparation meets opportunity in ways that change everything. Chief Warrant Officer Vesper Kine had written her name in the history of military aviation not with words, but with actions that spoke louder than any citation could capture. In a valley where even the SEALs had lost their edge, her Apache had crossed at mast height and reminded everyone that in the right hands, the impossible was just another tactical problem waiting to be solved.